A stuntman shoved Keanu Reeves on a studio lot. Not a disagreement. Not a heated exchange that got out of hand. A deliberate physical push, hand flat against chest. Full intention behind it. In front of witnesses in broad daylight at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, California. 10 seconds later, the stuntman was on the floor. Twice. Clint Eastwood watched the whole thing and didn't say a word for a long time afterward. This is what happened. His name was Boone Rader, and if you worked in Hollywood action cinema in the early years of that decade, you knew it. 6'3", 260 pounds. 15 years in the stunt business, car crashes, building falls, firework, the kind of physical punishment that leaves a permanent record on the body. A scar along his left forearm from a production in New Mexico where something went slightly wrong and slightly wrong was still enough. A shoulder that talked to him when the weather changed. A knuckle on his right hand that had healed imperfectly and stayed that way. He wore these things the way other men wore credentials because to him that's exactly what they were. He was not Clint's bodyguard. The distinction mattered to him more than he would have said out loud. He was Clint's stunt consultant. The man brought in when a project required someone who understood how dangerous sequences actually worked, not how they looked from behind a monitor. That Wednesday afternoon, he was at Warner Brothers because Clint had a meeting about a new project, and the project had action in it, and Clint trusted Boone's eye on those things more than he trusted the opinions of people who had only ever watched dangerous work from a safe distance. What Clint didn't know, what Boone hadn't said to anyone, hadn't even fully said to himself, was the thing that had been sitting in him for months. After The Matrix, the whole industry changed the way it talked about actors and fighting. Suddenly, Keanu Reeves was everywhere. Magazine profiles, press appearances, interview after interview describing him as disciplined, committed, genuinely skilled. People said it like it was settled fact. Like the months of training explained everything about what appeared on screen. Boone had friends who worked that production. He knew what went into those sequences from the inside. The wire rigs. The camera angles chosen with meticulous care to make certain things appear possible that would not have been possible otherwise. The stunt performers who spent weeks, sometimes months, building the physical vocabulary of every scene before a single frame was shot. He knew all of it because he was the kind of person who built those things for other people to step into and receive the credit for. He hadn't named what he felt about that. He was not a man given to examining his own feelings. But the feeling was there, had been there for a while, quiet and settled, the way certain things settle when they've been sitting in the same place long enough. That afternoon, it was close to the surface. The meeting ran long. By the time Clint and Boone stepped back out into the California afternoon, the light had shifted lower, softer, the shadows between the sound stages grown long across the pavement. They were cutting through the middle of the lot, taking the short route back toward the parking structure, when Clint slowed his pace. Near stage 9, 40 feet ahead, a man stood talking beside a cart of camera equipment. Plain black t-shirt, jeans with the kind of fade that comes from actual use, running shoes that had clearly been used for running. No assistant, no publicist, no one managing the space around him. Just a man having a conversation in the afternoon, entirely at ease. Clint raised a hand. Keanu turned. A moment of recognition, then a smile. Not the one people assemble for cameras, just the one that happens when you're genuinely glad to see someone. He said something brief to the cinematographer he'd been speaking with, a man named Harlan Voss, and walked over with the unhurried ease of someone who doesn't measure the significance of a moment by the speed at which they approach it. They shook hands, Clint and Keanu. Two men who had occupied the same industry long enough to have genuine respect for each other without requiring close friendship to justify it. Good to see you out here, Clint said. Meetings, Keanu said. Something new? Early stages. You know how it goes. Then Clint turned slightly. This is Boone Rader. Works with me on the action side. One of the best in the business. Keanu looked at Boone and extended his hand. Good to meet you. Boone didn't take it. He looked at Keanu the way a man looks at something he's already made up his mind about, evaluating without genuine curiosity, measuring without real interest in the result. His hand stayed at his side. After a beat that lasted just long enough to register as deliberate, he gave a single slow nod. That was all. Keanu lowered his hand without any visible reaction. If the slight landed, he didn't carry it anywhere it could be seen. Boone spoke first. He said the Matrix was something. He said it the way people say things when the compliment is a container for something else entirely. The choreography, the camera work, the wire rigs, all of it working together, he said, to shape what an audience believes it's watching rather than what's actually happening in front of the lens. Measured. Reasonable. The tone of someone offering context they thought the other person might find useful. It was not a compliment. Everyone within earshot understood that without needing it explained. Keanu listened without interrupting. When Boone finished, Keanu said simply that the stunt team on that film was extraordinary. That he'd said so publicly many times and meant it every time. Boone's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but it did. Clint shifted his weight and put a hand briefly on Boone's arm. This is a good place to stop. Boone registered it the way a man registers a yellow light when he has already decided he is running it. What came next was not loud. It didn't need to be. Boone said he had given 15 years to this industry. Real impacts, real injuries, risks that no camera angle could soften and no second take could undo. He and people like him were the reason certain kinds of films could exist at all. And when audiences walked out talking about how convincing the action was, how skilled the performer seemed, the conversation always arrived at the same place. The name on the poster. Never the names of the people who had made the poster possible. He was not wrong. That was the thing. There was truth in it, real truth, earned through 15 years of doing something genuinely dangerous for modest compensation and almost no public recognition. The problem was not what he was saying. It was what he was doing with it, where he was aiming it. Harlan Voss had stepped back and stood at a careful distance, his expression neutral in the practiced way of someone who has learned when not to be visibly present in a conversation that doesn't belong to him. Clint said Boone's name. Quiet. Just his name, the way you say it when you need someone to hear the thing underneath the word rather than the word itself. Boone didn't look at him. He took a step forward. One step, closing the distance between himself and Keanu by a precise and deliberate amount. Not a lunge. Just a step, executed with the calm of someone who has spent years understanding how space and proximity communicate power without requiring a word to be spoken. Then he placed his hand flat against Keanu's chest and pushed. Not a punch. Not designed to injure. But not gentle either. The kind of push that carries a specific and legible message, that the person delivering it is larger, heavier, more experienced in the physical grammar of confrontation, and that the person receiving it should feel all three of those things in the 2 steps backward it was constructed to produce. Keanu didn't take those 2 steps. He didn't take one. His weight was already low and settled in a way that had nothing performative about it. Not a stance, nothing that announced itself, just the settled balance of someone whose body understood, without being consciously instructed, how to receive force without surrendering ground to it. He didn't move. Clint stepped forward. But before he could get between them, Keanu spoke. Quietly, directly, his eyes on Boone and nowhere else. Are you sure you want to do this? No edge in it. No performance of calm. Just a question, asked in the way you ask something when you genuinely want the other person to have thought it through before they answer. Boone held his gaze. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. Keanu looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, not agreement, just acknowledgement. The nod of someone for whom something has been confirmed that they'd already half expected. He suggested they move inside. Stage 14 was empty today, no production scheduled, enough space and enough privacy to handle whatever this was going to be without pulling the rest of the lot into it. He said it the way someone proposes a practical solution to a logistical problem. No urgency. No drama. No indication that what he was walking toward concerned him in any way that mattered. It wasn't a concession. Keanu wasn't retreating. He was choosing the terms. And in doing that, quietly and without announcement, He had already taken something from the encounter that Boone hadn't yet realized was available to be taken. Boone started walking without another word. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate on the studio pavement. Clint followed. Behind him, Harlan Voss and a handful of crew members who had stopped pretending they had somewhere else to be. The door of stage 14 was metal, gray, slightly rusted at the lower hinge. Keanu pushed it open. It gave with a low groan that carried across the empty lot and then went quiet. They went inside. Dark. The particular dark of a large space that hasn't been used in a while. Not simply the absence of light but the presence of scale, of height, of air that had not been moved in some time. The ceiling rose 50 feet overhead and disappeared into the shadows above the dormant lighting grid. Equipment along the walls, covered in canvas. Cables coiled in broad loops on the concrete floor. The smell of dust and old metal and the stillness of a space that has held many things and is currently holding nothing. The only illumination came from thin lines of afternoon daylight pressing through gaps high on the south wall. Enough to see the broad shapes of things. Not enough to see everything. Keanu walked to the center of the floor. Each step placed without hurry or self-consciousness. He reached the middle of the open space, turned to face the door, and waited. He didn't adopt a stance. Didn't raise his hands or shift his weight into any position that would signal preparation. He stood with his feet roughly shoulder-width apart, hands loose at his sides, center of gravity settled low in the natural way of someone whose body had learned, through long practice, to be ready without advertising it. To anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, he looked like a man waiting for a bus. Entirely present. Entirely unbothered. Boone handed his jacket to Clint without looking at him. Clint took it without comment and moved back toward the wall. Boone rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, drew a slow breath. 15 years of preparation ritual running its sequence. Not conscious thought, just the body knowing what comes next. He was not nervous. He had not been nervous in a physical confrontation in a very long time. What he felt was certainty. The particular kind that arrives when a person has already decided how something ends. Clint stood against the wall, arms crossed, Harlan Voss a few feet to his left. The crew members who had followed them in had arranged themselves along the perimeter without being directed. Nobody spoke. "Whenever you're ready," Keanu said. Even, unhurried. Boone moved. Fast, genuinely fast, in the way that always surprised people who assumed they knew what 260 pounds would cost a man in speed. His footwork showed the years of training, efficient, organized, closing distance without telegraphing intent. He threw a left jab first. Not committed, not intended to land. Just measuring. Keanu's head moved 2 inches to the right. The jab found air. Boone planted his back foot and drove forward, putting everything behind a straight right hand. His full weight, his full intention, the accumulated force of someone who had spent years understanding how to deliver exactly this kind of punch. The kind that, if it connects, ends the conversation before either person has to say anything else. Keanu turned his left shoulder forward by a quarter rotation. Nothing more. The punch traveled past him close enough that the displacement of air from it would have been perceptible. Found nothing. Before Boone could pull his arm back and reset, something happened at his right forearm. A contact, light, almost polite, the kind of touch that in any other context would not have registered as worth noticing. But it wasn't a grab. It was a guide. And in the fraction of a second that followed, through a hip throw executed with the clean precision of something drilled until the mechanics had stopped being conscious decisions and simply became how the body moved, Boone's own forward momentum became the instrument of what happened next. His feet left the ground. The ceiling appeared briefly in his field of vision. Then the floor arrived. 260 pounds on concrete. The sound filled the entire soundstage and traveled through the floor and up through the feet of every person standing at its edges. Dust lifted from the concrete in a slow pale cloud and hung in the thin lines of afternoon light. Silence. Then instinct. The kind that had kept him functional for 15 years in a profession where stopping was not an option. He was already pushing to one knee when his hand shot out and closed around Keanu's ankle. His fingers wrapped around the joint completely. His intention was immediate and simple. Pull, destabilize, bring this down to where size and weight could renegotiate the terms. Keanu didn't brace against it. He dropped. Not fell, dropped. Deliberate, controlled. His entire body descending in a single fluid movement that used the grip itself as an anchor and rotated cleanly around it. In the same motion, continuous and unbroken, a clean sweep at Boone's base leg. Boone went down a second time. Harder. Silence again. Different this time. Flatter. More complete. Keanu stood 2 steps back. Not breathing hard. Expression unchanged. No triumph in his face. Nothing that performed itself for the people watching. The same unhurried stillness that had been present since he walked through the door, as though the past 10 seconds had been entirely unremarkable. The crew members stood exactly where they'd been standing. Nobody had moved. Nobody had spoken. Clint Eastwood had not moved from his position against the wall. His arms were still crossed. But something behind his eyes had shifted. Some quiet recalibration happening in a man who had spent 4 decades playing characters defined by a specific and recognizable kind of strength, and had believed, until approximately 10 seconds ago, that he understood what real capability looked like when it wasn't filtered through a camera and a script. He was looking at Keanu the way a person looks at something they have no existing category for. "Could someone get him some water?" Keanu said, his eyes still on Boone. "He'll be dizzy when he sits up." Same quiet voice. Same level tone. Boone lay on the concrete with one arm across his chest, gaze fixed somewhere in the shadows above him. Jaw tight. Breathing controlled in the specific way of someone working to maintain control rather than someone who simply has it. He was replaying it. The jab, the right hand, the contact at his forearm. The throw. The grip, the drop, the sweep. Running it from the beginning, looking for the point where a different decision might have produced a different result. He could not find it. That, more than the impact, more than the dust still settling around him, was what held him there. He sat up slowly. When his eyes found Keanu, they hadn't lost their edge. "Do it again," he said. Low. Flat. Keanu looked at him without answering immediately. "Do it again." Something underneath the words now, not quite anger, not quite desperation, but the specific combination that arrives when a man needs a second chance not to win but to understand. Keanu shook his head. Slowly, without apology. "Nothing changes if we do it again, Boone. The same things happen for the same reasons. A rematch doesn't answer the question you're actually asking." Clint stepped forward and placed himself between them. Not forcefully, just present. His hand came to rest on Boone's shoulder with the quiet authority of someone who knows the difference between a moment that needs to continue and one that needs to stop. Something passed between the two of them, wordless, the communication of people who have worked alongside each other long enough to share a language that doesn't require words. The tension in Boone's frame shifted. Didn't disappear. Settled. The room stayed quiet. Nobody had left. Near the wall, half covered by a canvas drop cloth, was a low wooden equipment crate. Keanu walked over to it, pulled the cloth aside, and sat down with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at Boone. "Can I tell you something? Not about the fight. About something else." Boone said nothing, but he was listening. Some part of him, the part still running that sequence and finding no satisfying answer at the end of it, understood that what he was looking for was not going to come from going again. Keanu chose his words carefully. Not for effect, for accuracy. "When I started training for the Matrix, I thought I understood what I was walking into. About a month in, I realized I didn't understand anything. Not the movements, not the principles behind them, not why certain things work in certain situations and fail in others. Every day I trained, the primary thing I learned was how much I still didn't know." He paused. "There's a difference between training until something looks real and training until something is real. One of those has a ceiling you eventually reach. The other one doesn't." He let it sit for a moment. "A lot of what you saw on screen had technical support behind it. Guai rigs. Camera choices. Editing decisions. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But I trained every day because I genuinely wanted to understand what I was doing, not just perform it convincingly. That difference mattered to me. It still does. Then, more directly, you know what I saw when you came at me? Certainty. Complete certainty that you already knew how this was going to end. And I understand that certainty. It's kept you safe in work that would have broken someone less sure. But in this room, it made you rigid. When you committed to that right hand, you'd already written the next line. You couldn't adapt because you'd already decided what came next. I didn't fight your strength. I followed the direction you had already chosen. The soundstage held the silence that followed without difficulty. Large spaces are good at that. Boone sat with it. He was not a man who moved quickly through things that required him to revise something fundamental. Nobody is when the thing being revised isn't a technique but a belief about yourself. But he was listening differently than he'd listened at any point earlier in the afternoon. He asked the question that had been underneath everything. Not the tactical question. The real one. Where does it come from? The way you move. The way you saw it before it happened. Keanu thought before he answered, which was itself the beginning of the answer. Paying attention, he said, not just in training, everywhere, and staying in the place where you don't know yet. Most people, when they get genuinely good at something, stop being willing to be a beginner. They protect what they've built. That protection costs something, the ability to keep learning, the willingness to be wrong. Rigidity is the one thing that size and experience cannot compensate for. Not in the long run. He stood and extended his hand to Boone. Not victory. Something quieter. The handshake of one person acknowledging another across the distance of a genuinely difficult afternoon. Boone looked at it, then took it. What you've built over 15 years is real, Keanu said. It matters. It's a foundation. The question is whether a foundation is where you stop or where you start. He said it without condescension. Not delivering a lesson from a position above. Just saying something he believed plainly because the situation called for honesty. There's a difference between those two things. Boone heard it. Keanu picked up his jacket and moved toward the door. Clint fell into step beside him. They walked for a few paces in the particular silence of two people who've witnessed the same thing and are each privately turning it over. At the door, Clint stopped. How long did it take you, he said, to be able to do that? Keanu stopped. Turned the question over with genuine attention before answering. Time isn't really the variable, he said. It's the reason. If you train to prove something, you reach the limit of what proof requires and stop. If you train to understand, there's no ceiling. Understanding keeps moving as long as you're willing to follow it. Clint gave a slow nod. Not the nod of someone hearing something polite. The nod of someone hearing something true and deciding where to put it. Keanu pushed the door open. The afternoon came in, lower now, warmer. The particular gold of a California day that has used most of itself up and is settling toward evening. He stepped through it and was gone. The door swung shut. Clint stood where he was for a long moment, jacket folded over one arm, looking at the closed door the way a person looks when they're not seeing the door at all, but something just behind it. A thought still forming. A question not yet ready to be spoken. The story never made the trades. No column items. No roundup mentions. No photographs through a gap in a soundstage door. Stories like this one don't travel through official channels. They move the way certain things have always moved in a community small enough that everyone eventually knows everyone. Through late evening phone calls, conversations in the back of equipment trucks, the particular shorthand that exists between people who share a demanding profession and have learned to trust each other across many difficult days on many different sets. Within a few weeks of that Wednesday afternoon at Warner Brothers, the people who needed to know what had happened in Stage 14 knew. Details shifted in the telling, as they always do. But the core survived every version, because it was simple and specific enough to travel without distortion. A man who had spent 15 years being the most physically capable person in every room he entered had found, in 10 seconds on a concrete floor, that his understanding of capability had been incomplete in ways he hadn't known to examine. Boone didn't quit. This is the part that surprises people who assume they already know how the story ends. He didn't resign. He didn't disappear into a different city or a different profession. He stayed, and he tried to figure out what staying was going to require of him now that certain things he had believed were no longer available to believe. He was quieter on set in the weeks that followed. Did his work with the same precision that had always defined him professionally. But the quality of his attention had changed in a way that people who worked alongside him could feel without being able to name. He watched differently, listened differently, found himself noticing things he had previously looked past. One evening, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of a production facility in the valley with the engine off and the windows up, he called a man named Wes Cullen, a stunt coordinator with more than 20 years in the business who had worked on the Matrix productions and knew their physical architecture from the inside. Boone asked him one question, not what he'd read about Keanu. What was he actually like day to day in the room where the real work happened? Wes was quiet for a moment. He asked why before he asked how. Wes said, every time, wanted to understand the principle behind something before he put it in his body. Stayed late not to accumulate hours, but because something genuinely interested him and he wasn't done with it yet. A pause. He didn't train to look dangerous. He trained because he was actually curious. That's rarer than people think. Boone thanked him and ended the call and sat in the dark for a long while. Several weeks later, he sent a message through Keanu's production office. Brief and direct, the only two modes he'd ever known how to operate in. He wasn't looking for a rematch or a formal resolution. He had questions he thought only one person could answer honestly. He asked if Keanu was willing to speak. Keanu agreed without conditions. They met on a Saturday morning at a small training facility in Glendale, the kind of place that exists in working neighborhoods and serves working people. No ambient music. No polished surfaces. Equipment that was functional, well-maintained, and not designed to impress anyone. Keanu was already inside when Boone arrived, moving through a warm-up with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. They sat with coffee on a bench along the wall and talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about technique. Not about stage 14, at least not directly. They talked about the things that live underneath technique, about what a person is actually doing when they train, and why the reason behind it shapes everything the training produces. About confidence built through real experience and the way it can calcify, if you're not careful about examining it, into something that closes doors it was originally designed to open. You needed your certainty, Keanu said at one point. It kept you functional in work that would have broken someone less sure. But certainty about what you've already encountered is different from certainty about what you haven't. The first one is experience. The second is assumption. And assumption is expensive because you pay for it exactly when you can least afford to. Boone listened, asked questions that were honest rather than defensive, sat with the answers instead of reaching immediately for the counterargument. Before they left, he said something he hadn't planned to say when he walked through the door, that he had spent 15 years being very good at his job, and for most of that time he had confused being good at his job with being right about everything adjacent to it. That those were not the same thing. That he wished he'd seen the distinction earlier. Keanu nodded. That, he said quietly, is not a small thing to see clearly. They shook hands at the door and went their separate ways. No formal conclusion. No ceremony. Just two people who had arrived at a Wednesday afternoon from completely different directions and had, over the course of a few difficult weeks, found their way to a conversation that neither of them had been looking for. Years later, at a private dinner in the Hollywood Hills, Clint sat across from a director he'd known long enough to speak plainly to, a man named Russell Dane, and told the story of Stage 14 for the first time to someone who hadn't been there. He told it completely. The lot, the meeting, the push, the 10 seconds, the wooden crate, the conversation at the door, the afternoon light when Keanu left. Russell listened without interrupting. When Clint finished, Russell asked what he'd taken from it. Clint was quiet for a moment. He said he'd spent 40 years building characters defined by a specific kind of strength. The kind that announces itself. The kind that fills a room and knows it fills a room. and that what he'd watched in stage 14 was something he didn't have a character for. Strength that had no interest in announcing itself. Capability that didn't need to be recognized as capability to function as capability. He was being careful, Clint said. Not restrained, careful. There's a difference. Careful means you understand exactly what you have and you're choosing, deliberately, how much of it this moment deserves. That doesn't come from talent. It comes from knowing yourself well enough to trust yourself. Most people never quite get there. Russell asked about Boone. He came around, Clint said. Slowly. The way real change always happens. Not in one moment of clarity, but in a long series of smaller ones that accumulate into something different. Less certain and more curious. In a profession that rewards real adaptability, that combination made him better at his work. Not despite what happened in stage 14. Because of it. Russell said that sounded like a good ending. Clint picked up his cigar and considered it. I'm not sure it's an ending, he said finally. Feels more like a beginning. The kind you can only recognize in retrospect, after enough time has passed to understand what it was actually the start of. What stays with me about that Wednesday afternoon isn't the 10 seconds on the floor of stage 14. It's what those 10 seconds made possible afterward. Boone Raider wasn't a villain. He was a capable man who made the mistake that capable people are perhaps most vulnerable to, believing that what they've built is a complete picture rather than one perspective on an incomplete one. Most of us make some version of that mistake. Usually in the domain where we feel most competent. Usually without realizing it until something makes it impossible to look away. What Keanu did was not simply win. He remained afterward. Sat down on a wooden crate in a dark soundstage and spoke honestly, without superiority, without performance, to a man who had just tried to humiliate him. That's a choice. The kind that requires a security that has nothing to do with what you can do in a fight. Clint walked out of stage 14 the same man who walked in. But he carried something with him that he'd spend years quietly sitting with. Not loudly. Not publicly. Some things you don't talk about. You just let them change you slowly, in the places where change actually happens. Boone Raider still works. Still shows up early. Still does the work that most people will never see and never know to ask about. But if you talk to the people who work alongside him regularly, they'll tell you something has shifted. They won't always be able to name it precisely. He asks more questions than he used to. That's usually how they put it. He asks more questions than he used to.